Hello, I'm Rosie Gallagher from Hay Street Studio, and today I have the pleasure of having a conversation with composer Andrew Norman, whose wonderful piece, The Companion Guide to Rome, will be performed on Friday, February 7th at our season launch concert. This piece is written for string trio, so violin, viola, and cello, and is a musical portrait of 9 Roman cathedrals that Andrew lived among for a year of his life. The piece is rich in texture, imagination, and in scope, and it's amazing to have some behind the scenes insight into how it all came to life. So, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us.
Yes, my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Just to start, could you take us back to maybe where it all began for you? So, like, where did you grow up and how did music kind of first enter your life?
Yeah, oh, all right, sure. um, so I grew up a little bit in the Midwest, in Michigan, in Illinois, and then when I was about 9 years old, my family moved to Central California. And I think when I was a small child, I was very curious about music and musical toys and things of that nature. My parents saw that this was something I was into, so they rented a piano when I was 6. And I think that I always viewed that space as a kind of creative space. So even though I was taking piano lessons, it was always like I was more interested in fiddling around and making up my own things. And then a little bit later, I started playing string instruments, violin and viola, and then that also became a real outlet for me because then the music was suddenly about community in a very real way. And I think those are the sort of still the fundamentals of my identity as a musician. It's about creativity and exploration and also community and making things with and for other people. So yes, and I also grew up being a church musician. I played a lot in those kinds of settings growing up, and then I studied music in college and became a composer. um, so yeah, I think that's a little bit of my background. But I do think that even now, when I'm composing, I always go back to my instruments and often to the viola, in terms of finding sounds and physical ways of approaching the instrument that I'm connected to.
Yeah, it's the viola movement in this piece is amazing. We'll get to that, but okay, that makes more sense that you play string instruments. I didn't actually know that about you because I was thinking, oh my God, how do you start to do that, right, for instruments that you don't play? But of course, you've written for like wind instruments too, and obviously you have dabbled. Did you play any of those instruments as well, or was that kind of?
No, no, I've never really played a wind instrument, but I think, for the instruments I don't play, it's trying to find out as much information as I can from the people who do play them and finding out not just is this playable, but what does it feel like? Trying to find out, also I find that the different instruments shape people's ideas about what music is
Yeah.
and like you talk to a brass player, they have completely different ideas about musicality and being a musician and what that means and how it's connected to their body than string players do. Are you a string player or
No, I'm a flute player.
are you a flute player?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, we all have these very different ideas, and it's fascinating to interface with the ones I'm more familiar with because I inhabit them myself, and the ones I'm not as familiar with. But I do think that is part of my job as composer.
Definitely. Curious, like as you were kind of, finding your communities, letting music kind of widen your world. I suppose that's what I think it does for a lot of us. Opens us up a bit, hopefully.
Mhm.
Did you listen to contemporary music growing up? Like, when did that kind of first cross your radar? Living composers, all of that stuff.
Yeah, such a good question. I did not listen to much of it when I was a kid, and maybe towards the end of high school, when I was becoming more serious about composing, I started to get to know some of the kind of mainstream orchestral composers who are still alive and working, the kind of John Adams and John Corigliano in America, and a few of the Europeans as well. And but that was not it was not really until I got to college, and I really kind of, as many people do when they get to college and start studying music, like, oh, there's a whole world of things going on right now and people making music in all these amazing ways. So that was, really where I first came to know what contemporary music can be. And sometimes, as with a lot of people too, I liked some of it, I didn't like others of it. I was a little confused at times about like where my voice might fit in or what I might be in relation to all the things that were happening in the field. And yeah, I do remember with Companion Guide specifically, which I wrote. It's got to be about 15 years ago now. And I was like around 30, so I had been in school for a while and out of school, and was making my way as a young professional. And I was living in Berlin actually at the time, and feeling very unsure of kind of these issues they tell me, like, what is my voice, and how do I fit in with music history, and what kinds of things could I or should I be doing. And that produced a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for me. And what really brought me back, actually, in addition to the experiences of these actual buildings, which we can talk about, but it was really my relationship with my instrument, which was like, oh, I can go back to the viola, I can find things that I just physically enjoy making, and I'm like excite my ear, and those things can then be the basis of a voice and a creative perspective. So
Mm.
that's how I got
It,
to a lot of the music in this piece.
it blows my mind the amount of pressure you must feel as like composers, anybody that's creating something from nothing. How do you do it?
I mean, what blows my mind is people who get up in front of other people and make sound on instruments without completely flipping out. So,
we flip. um, I suppose, yeah, it's just kind of speaking to that for a second, as, you know, from the innocence of just playing with sounds and exploring that as a child to kind of formalizing that and, as you say, finding your voice. Like, have you found a through thread through all of this with the creative process? Massive question, but curious in terms of, have things that have started as challenging, have they remained challenging in this process? And things that have remained as a payoff, has that stayed the same too?
yeah, I mean, I think uh, for me, the creative process has not gotten easier. It remains a very um, daunting challenge to face the unknown and to face the, like, we have nothing and you're going to make something. And to that every time I do it, it's not like I have a formula to
No.
get through it. And I mean, the crazy thing is that I've gone through this process so many times, and it always, every time, feels like I've never done it before. And even when I end up, midway through the process or towards the end, being like, oh yeah, I can see how this relates to the things I've done before, and I can see how this is part of my creative journey and trajectory, and I can see I can see it. I can never see it when I'm started. So it's like always finding the thing, and often refinding the things, even though I've known what they were for like the piece before and the piece before. So with I will say something. There is this thing that has happened, and it definitely happened with Companion Guide, where it's like I'm interested in some sounds and some feelings, and I have some ideas about what I'm trying, what interests me, but I need that to connect to some experience or emotional response to something in the world, like some inspiration or some idea. And usually it's like the sounds and the idea have to meet somewhere
Mm.
um, in the process before something happens, and before I'm able to, like, make something. So with this piece, it was like it was this living in Rome and having this amazing year there and exploring all these churches and having all these experiences. But it wasn't actually until I wrote one of the movements while I was living there, the last one. And then it wasn't until 2 years later, I was back living in Europe, and I decided to kind of approach this again, this idea I had when I was there. And it was like the sounds, and they all just kind of, it all comes together. And from that inspiration, then I can work. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but it's so, I mean, it's exciting and deeply frustrating sometimes to be like, I know I've done this so many times before, don't know what it is now.
Test of courage, I imagine, again and again, and faith in the self. Um, Thank you for doing that though, because it's I think that's kind of a rarity to kind of pursue that way of being, because I can imagine it really is an entire way of being, and being patient with yourself too. And you've created some amazing music, so we thank you for that.
Oh,
um,
thank you. No, thank you. And also, like I said before too, it is one kind of creative act, but that is not to diminish the other creative
oh,
acts which are involved in the performance of a thing and the making of something in front of other human beings, which I think is ultimately like we are sharing a space and making, like you are making sound with and for other people, and that is like ultimately where the art is, and the meaning of it like comes from you all interpreting, choosing, making in the moment, and other people experiencing that energy, which I also find absolutely magical. So thank you. Please thank your performers for me.
we
So
will. No, we have got some brilliant performers coming in for this, so I'll pass that on. Um, yeah, it's probably nice to then kind of chat a little bit about Companion Guide. And yeah, I just wanted to share that kind of the first time I heard this piece was actually in a road trip. So I was in the car with my partner Lee, and we often listen to kind of big loads of music when we do these big trips. And he was like lit up, being like, I've got to show you something. So he put on Companion Guide, and we didn't speak for kind of the next 30 minutes, which isn't always the case. We interject a lot. But it was just such a captivating piece of music. We kind of were enthralled. And to me, just listening to it through, it just felt like this story in a way. It felt like quite a narrative. I don't know if that was the intention, but yeah, I'm just curious. I know you just spoke a little bit about when you first went to Rome and were walking around in these churches. What's it like being in Rome now, and what's it like to spend a year there?
I mean, so I was young when I went. I think I was 26. Um, and I had never lived abroad before. I'd never done anything like that, and it was a truly amazing year. So I was living at this place, the American Academy in Rome, which has artists and scholars living for like a year together. So it was an amazing community, a lot of ideas, a lot of interactions, a lot of sparking creativity, and but I also spent a lot of time just walking and exploring the city. And of course, getting to know not only the famous parts of that city, but the less famous parts. It's an unlike any other place on earth because it's so layered.
Mm.
And there are these amazing artifacts and spaces and objects that are from so many different periods of history, going back thousands of years. So, and then of course the Romans they've not preserved any one of them in a totally pure way, but they keep adding and subtracting, and so even the older ones have this incredible sense of layeredness to them as well, of changing and adapting and moving and with the different centuries. So yeah, so I mean, it started as just kind of a journal, a kind of mental and photographic journal of like, this is what I'm really drawn to in the city, and visiting these different spaces and having different kinds of experiences in the different spaces with no real idea of what I was going to do, except for the last movement, which came first. I had this experience in this church, Santa Sabina, watching sunrise inside the church. The windows, it is one of the oldest standing churches in Rome. It's like from the 5th century. Don't quote me on that. It's very, very old, and retains somewhat of the purity of this of those earliest Roman basilicas. And its windows are actually made of translucent stone. So like the light shines through and makes these super beautiful patterns on the walls when it goes through the stone. And so I watched sunrise. I was like, okay, I've got to do this. It really spoke to me. I came up with the first draft version of that piece there. But I sort of knew even then that the kind of story that last movement tells was not the complete story of this thing, was not the complete experience. And then I wanted to kind of build in and up to that. And so A couple years later, when I had time in my schedule and I was sitting there in Berlin and thinking about what I wanted to do, I knew I wanted to come back to this, and I had all these kind of journaled experiences and ideas um, that I wanted to create as a series, kind of like a procession of experiences that would lead up to this big one at the end. And so, like a lot of my pieces actually do follow a similar trajectory where I come up with the end first, or I come up with like the kind of where we're going or the point of the big thing. And so I had that, and then it became about trying to find a lot of other little things that were each inspired by a different thing in a different church. So some of them, a couple of the movements are about floor patterns, because they have these amazing floor patterns in Rome, these little colored marble pieces that were actually assembled from ruins of ancient buildings that they took and they chopped them up into these little these floor patterns. And I was totally taken with that. And some of them are about the proportions of the church, so it's very kind of like math, like trying to reflect the proportions of a building and music. And then some of them are very emotional responses to the art that was in these churches. Um, uh, or this, and then also the embedded in there too is the stories of the saints, because the stories of the saints get kind of wrapped up in these buildings too. So some of them are kind of also like that, like a little bit of a narrative idea. It's funny how, you know, you read that so and so is the patron saint of this, that, or the other thing. Like Saint Ivo is the patron saint of like knowledge and the university, and his church is actually quite mathematical looking. Whether they intended it or not, I don't know. And or Santa Cecilia or Saint Cecilia is the patron saint of music, and there's this really kind of heavy story about how she was murdered, which is then reflected in this sculpture of her. And like all this kind of wraps up in your brain when you're in these places. So so that gets in it as well. And I think that last thing I'll say too is that I had this book with me, a very old guidebook called The Companion Guide to Rome, which is like it's like a mid-century, mid-20th century guidebook to Rome, which very not like Rick Steves or anything. It was actually quite has a lot of feeling and color to it as a perspective of this person who wrote it. And I started thinking about, I mean, I love the title of it, but also this book that I carried around, which had these very personal reflections on these churches. And then also my idea that like the churches themselves are almost personified in the music, or something of the spirit of them, and inhabiting almost like character studies. Like it's sure it's about the art and the architecture, but it's also like imagining a person, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does or not.
Makes total sense.
So
Yeah.
so that's kind of like, and like for me again, it was like all those ideas had to swim together, and then also me bubbling up with my little viola improvs and finding sounds that I like, and then together they coalesced into the movements that are in the piece.
Cool. Were you always settled on it being a string trio piece? Like, did you know, yeah, those are the sounds I want to explore, three stringies?
Good question, because you know, even back when I wrote Sabina, you know, the first sketches obviously on the viola, and I had a string trio of friends of mine who knew we wanted to collaborate on something, and I think it just worked really well. And I honestly, I love string trio as a medium. Again, it's the violist in me. It's like a viola centric medium. It's very balanced in that way. It also like I've never really been good at writing string quartets. I always get kind of freaked out. But string trio, it feels like a medium that doesn't quite feel so burdened.
I wonder
So I
why.
don't know, it's the medium. And for many reasons, I just I was drawn to it. So the original Sabina was string trio, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna make this a big string trio. And you know, I worked well in that medium.
It's very lush. Yeah, it's beautiful. I think that's what part of like one of the things I love about the piece is just kind of the range of textures you manage to get. Just to ask you a couple of pointed things about kind of things you've written in the score, just because I'm curious.
Yeah.
Like kind of working backwards. Yeah, with the Sicilian movement, just your marking that you put at the beginning, you say lyrical and free and with a touch of dementia. Curious, like I read a little bit about, her story, and it is really tragic and kind of interesting. What were you, with this kind of marking a touch of dementia, what were you looking for and to bring out in
Yeah.
this story?
Yeah. Well, so, I love musical markings that open up possibilities for performers to, figure out their own interpretations and find something for themselves. And so I think, how I imagined that movement, it's a solo violin movement. And I imagined it as kind of like a soliloquy of like this person, Saint Cecilia, and maybe so she took many days to die, right? Like they kept trying to kill her in different ways, and and it didn't work. And it's a long story, but basically, and at the one of the versions of the story goes that like she sang all the way through this process, and she sang all the way until she died. And like I was like imagining like the monologue of a person who is singing as their mind is kind of going crazy, or their mind is leaving, or their mind is leaving their body. And like what so what what
Mm.
does that sound like, and where could one go with that? Like, so yeah, I think that's where that idea, trying to suggest that this is like the monologue of someone who is in some way drifting away, um uh the inner
Mm.
monologue of someone who is I you can say whatever you want about floating off to somewhere, or their mind is separating out or doing something. And they're like, I also imagined it as kind of like inside one person there's a couple different sort of characters or voices within that piece. There's kind of two different kind of styles of writing, or two different approaches, and it's kind of a like an interior monologue between them. So I wanted it to sound like, yeah, lyrical, but also that there's this edge of crazy underneath it, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
I don't know, you can send that to the violinist.
Well, yeah. I reckon she'll have a lot of fun with that. Um, uh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I have a few people in my life who've suffered from dementia, and there is that kind of element of living in another reality, this kind of returning to the childlike, yeah, departing kind of the mind in this way. So it's an interesting marking. The other one that I was curious to just learn a little bit more about was the Susanna movement, of course,
Oh
the
yeah, yeah.
viola. And now I can picture you kind of standing with your viola scratching away, but it's just the most amazing effect. And I can imagine, I don't know how many times you've heard the piece, but I imagine that it's everybody probably approaches it a little bit differently and gets a little bit of a different expression.
Yeah.
What were you searching for, and what were you kind of trying to evoke with that movement?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and first thing, of course, I love that everyone does it differently. And it is like it's a technique. I describe the technique, but it's one for even the people who played the piece many times, you don't quite know what your instrument's going to do when you start to do it. And it does create this very vulnerable space for the performer, where they are reacting in real time to what their instrument's actually doing when they put this strange kind of physical impulse into it. And I do love that about the movement. It also destabilizes audiences too quite a bit, because they're like, well, what is happening?
Yeah.
Don't want to give it totally away, but like and it like for me, it is a physical embodiment of a lot of tension. Like you can't do this thing in a like free and loosey goosey way.
Yeah.
It's very physically embodied. So uh, in that particular church, there is a very, very, very old fresco, and it's actually kind of like in a back room somewhere. It's not like in the church, the big part of the church, and it's like kind of Byzantine era. And it is a depiction of the Virgin Mary, but there's a word for this, but she's actually kind of like the regal Virgin Mary, where she looks like a queen. But almost all of the fresco is gone, and it's just these tiny fragments of image, that and a lot of negative space or empty space on the wall. And like you can see at one point, you can kind of make out where her face is, and she has these kind of almond eyes, and they're very kind of intense. And but like there's very little image there. And so I was interested in this idea of trying to well, show something that is almost not there, right? Or is like just fragments of sound
Mm.
that uh, gradually as the piece goes on, it coalesces into something a little more continuous and recognizable, but like something that we are trying to put together the image of this thing, and we're only hearing these tiny little bits of it or these tiny sounds. So that was like one image that came from the church. But the intensity of the expression of that movement, I would say actually came when I was living in Berlin, so a couple years later. And this is also very weird and personal experience, but I was on a commuter train in the winter there in Berlin that ran over a person on the tracks. And we were stuck on the tracks for, I don't know, at least an hour. In my mind, it was 2 or 3 hours, but like, and I was with one friend of mine, and it was a very intense experience, um, of which I couldn't quite at the time process or didn't know. It was just a very destabilizing event.
Mm.
And then I went home after that, and this is the piece that happened. Um, and again, it's like I feel weird even about sharing that, but like that is baked into the movement. Not many people know that actually, but it somehow is like music is life. Music is us trying to figure out and respond, and that was somehow the 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 this feeling. It came out in music in a way that I don't even think I could express. I clearly am feeling now. So
Mm.
anyway, that's that movement.
Do you know there was a performance of that piece where that movement, it was at Yellow Barn, and Roger Tapping was playing the viola, and
Wait, were you there?
Lee was there, and he explained this to me afterwards. I think, yeah, he actually might have met you there.
Yeah, I was
Um,
there.
yeah, he described hearing that movement, or hearing Roger play it too, as just being like gutting, you're
Uh,
just gutting. So,
that was
yeah.
a yeah. I remember that vividly, of course, and that I'm so sad about his passing as well. But yeah, it does remind me these things are all I do think that the text, like the what we put down on the page, is a first of all, it's a living document, right? And it also like people invest so much of themselves in the text. I feel like it kind of lives inside the text somehow, like what people have done, not just how it exists on the internet or whatever. But I do feel like there's this,
Mm.
the tradition of music is about um, understanding what people have done with written text and what can be done. And I feel somehow like it all ends up in there in some. Now I feel like I'm talking like Harry Potter or something. It's
Keep
emotional,
going. I'm a Potter fan. That's right.
but there's there, and I remember
Yeah.
that performance very very vividly. So
Mm.
um, yeah, no, that's that movement.
Wonderful. Cool. Well, I just was curious. One more kind of little realm to ask you about was just seems like you're a bit of an architecture nerd, in the best way possible. And yeah, I'm just wondering, is that just a totally side hobby that you've kind of always, rabbit hole you've been interested in? And one other side question is, do you have a favorite building in the world, or like some piece of architecture that makes you go crazy?
Wow, do I have a favorite building? Yeah, well, architecture is definitely one of my kind of lifelong passions and interests. I'm just very inspired by buildings. I don't know why. And I did want to become an architect for a while. It's kind of like architecture, music. So I landed in music, and but like writing music about buildings, at least kind of maybe I don't do it so much anymore. But definitely in that period, 10, 15 years ago, I was doing it a lot. And I felt like it was enabling me to connect, all the things I loved, and or many of the things that I loved, and make stuff with it. And so yeah, it's a very productive frame for me. And even now, a lot of my work isn't directly inspired by this building or that building, but I would think and I would say a kind of architectural mind. And I'm like interested in the proportions of things and the shape of things and kind of reading things in this way that is not dissimilar to the way architects read buildings and conceive of buildings as um, um, a collection of disparate things and surfaces and spaces that all kind of add up to something. So it's definitely embedded in the way I think about music. And favorite buildings, I don't know. I mean, I love Disney Hall here in Los Angeles, where I am based. I'm there on a regular basis. I teach there. I go to concerts. It's like, but that hall. I was an usher for the LA Phil when they were building the hall. So across the street, when I was a kid, across the street watching them build it, and then inhabiting the hall, and now knowing the people. Like, to me, also the hall is the people who use it and who play in it on a regular basis in the Philharmonic, and those are all. So there's like a communal feeling that is both the building and the people, and also my kind of ideal space in which to encounter music, which is a space like that. So often when I'm imagining, especially like working with an orchestra, I'm like, my mind is just like Disney Hall and imagining how it works. I would love to come to Sydney sometime and see your opera house. I've heard good things about, but as
Yeah,
a building.
it's
Um,
wonderful. It's nice.
yeah, but it's just, I don't know. So I don't know if I would call it like my favorite building in the world, because I love lots and lots of all kinds of buildings. But to me, it is like kind of like been the central space that defines or expresses kind of like my feelings about the art form, art in general, but like music and what I want to do and where I want to do it and with whom. And I feel like it all just comes together. Plus, Frank Gehry's a super inspiring person. And he's had an impact on my creativity as well, and the conversations that we've been able to have. So all of that is wrapped up in a lot of beautiful feelings for me, you might
Mm, that always helps. Thank
say.
thank you so much for just sharing all of that. And honestly, it's just wonderful just to get to know you a little bit and have some insight into how you created this piece, which we are so proud to present here. And yeah, Sydney's not that far away.
Hey, gonna make it happen. And
Yeah,
when I
come
do,
on
I'm
over.
gonna look you up. Thank you so much
Come
for
on.
programming
It's
me.
oh, it's a real pleasure. And yeah, we'll see you hopefully sometime.
Okay, yes. All right. Well, have a nice day, and thank you, and thank you to the audience for listening to the piece. I'm just so happy this is happening.
Thanks, Andrew. Have a nice day.
All right, you too. Thanks. Bye.